Thank you. I couldn't decide what to wear, so I've put all of my layers, and I'm going to slowly strip throughout the presentation to give you all of my looks. Because I did a talk earlier today at Moncton, and I only wore one item, and I was not pleased after with the one item, so I'm going to go for 6 or 7 items tonight. I first wanted to start off by thanking the Owens Art Gallery and Mount Allison University, and specifically thanking a few people who've been super important to the project. I'd like to thank Jane, Roxy, and David, who have sort of helped me go through the archives, and this, I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but go through the archives and have been super generous in supporting my process-driven research creation methodology, which is mostly chaotic and sometimes coherent. And they've been fantastic with executing and helping me bring all of this work to life. And I also really wanted to thank Rachel and Lucy, who've been helpful and supportive in my week and 2 weeks here, and have given me a place to park my car after getting towed the first day I was here, and who've promoted my work on the wonderful social media on the Owens Art Gallery website and Instagram. And I really wanted to thank Emily for, as Emily described, we met a year ago. It's like wild to think it was not that long ago. And I'll get back to my first reaction when Emily said, I have an Alex Colville painting, would you like to make a project? And I went, yes, and then I thought, Alex Colville. I was like, what am I going to do with an Alex Colville painting? And I'm super happy with the process and what's come out of it. But at the beginning, it was a big question of how I would work with that. So let me start my talk. I like to start my talks by talking about my parents. Some of you in the audience have already started talking to my parents because you know them or have met them throughout time. I don't have a formal BA in art or art history or visual arts, but I did grow up in a family with a mother as a curator and a father who was a prominent artist, and a mother who was a prominent curator in Quebec and Canada and North America. So my dad, François Morelli, who some of you know, who is in the audience, is a performance artist who started making work in the late 60s, early 70s, and who has a practice that is interdisciplinary and performance-based. And I like to show these 2 images of my dad because we look a lot alike and our ages align. And as I have grown in my career and started making work, I've realized that it's not only the physical similarities, but also some of the vocabulary that I've developed that is both knowingly and unknowingly in direct relationship to my father, and that ends up being a central theme of a lot of the work that I've developed. My mom, Diane Charbonneau, was now recently retired, was a curator at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts for many years in the department of, curated design, photography, large other more interdisciplinary works and exhibitions. And so I grew up in a household that had this artist teacher at Concordia University and Université Rivière, and my mother who had worked at a museum who was a curator. So very much in the art world and of the art world, but not really desiring to be part of the art world. When I was a kid, my dad and I, and my mom also to a certain extent, collaborated on different projects. I call it collaboration now because I can, but at the time it's up for debate whether or not it was active collaboration. Basically my dad allowed me to make a bunch of different projects with him. This is a very early project in 1998 where I was 9 years old, where we used the software called KidPix, which is a early software that Mac had made, drawing software. The basic premise was that we would do these exquisite corpses. So one of us would make the top, one of us would make the bottom, and then we'd mash them together and have an exquisite corpse. My dad sort of dug them out a couple of years ago now, and we had them woven in collaboration with a weaver whose name is Geneviève Moisan, who was at Concordia and is in Quebec, and she weaved the original image, which had now been transferred onto JPEG, was on floppy disks for a while and sort of has evolved in its technology. And she wove them into these large jacquards, which are about 5 feet in height. Actually, they end up being a little bit bigger than the dimensions of this in the print. She had to rework some of the images because she couldn't get exactly the sort of graphic nature that Mac had made, or but they ended up being this series of large 7 jacquards of the exquisite corpses that were shown. And the reason to show this is to show the relationship between my father and I in this work, but also to kind of bring up this notion of filiation and genealogy, and that I've been involved in this indirectly or directly throughout my whole life. And my dad and I now have debates and questions about who drew what. He always takes credit for the best part, tells me I was the one drawing the penises. I don't think that's entirely true, but I think maybe he has a better sense of them. He says that there's some that have the F and the D to distinguish them, but throughout the years they've sort of become this collaborative project. So I moved to Toronto in 2011 to start a master's at the University of Toronto. Until then, I'd been living in my parents' basement. I moved from the top to the basement. As I was saying before, I had no desire at all to make art. I had been very involved in theater and drama. I'd been an athlete my whole life. I had done some singing, tried to play guitar, lots of saxophone. But the art world was very much my parents, and I went to openings, and everyone either knew one or the other or both, and I was always the son of, and so I had no real desire for that. But I moved to Toronto, and I started this program in performance studies, which was an interdisciplinary field, very rooted in anthropology, ethnography, theater studies. And I went there with the intention very specifically to do theory, to look at the history of the cult of the body in Germany, specifically the relationship between sports and theater, and Oscar Schlemmer. And about 2 weeks in, I was in this class, and the class was called Intro to Solo Performance. And I was in this class, and we were asked to present on these artists. We were each given an artist to pick from, or we were given a series of artists to pick from, and I picked an artist named William Popel, who's an African-American artist who actually right now has a show at MoMA and at the Whitney. His pieces, quite a big show at MoMA and a big piece at the Whitney, who in the 1970s, late 1970s, started a series of crawls in which he crawled through the streets of, starting in New York, New Jersey, through New York, actually starting in New York and in New York, New Jersey, and then in other places in North America, and then across the world. And the gesture of crawling for William was this idea of a military crawl. It was a black body that was usually seen as down and out in the sort of American landscape, but that was now activated through this motion of crawling, and therefore sort of subverting the expectations of homelessness, of blackness on the streets of New York. So I decided to give this lecture on William, in large part because I really liked William's work, and the reason I liked William's work is most likely because my dad went to school with William, so I'd been exposed to William's work because my dad had been a graduate student, or had actually been teaching while William was a graduate student. I was also interested in William's work because I had this biographical nature relationship to it, but also I was connected to it just in its embodied presence. And so I decided that I would give this talk, and then in thinking about giving this talk, this is like November, week 3 of school, I also decided, well, a talk isn't enough because I'm going to be an overachiever and really want to go over the top. I'm going to recreate one of William's crawls. And so one of the important things to say is that from the very beginning in 1978, William claims that he invited people to crawl with him, but no one would crawl with him in 1978. But now William is at the MoMA, and he crawled a couple of weeks ago, and there were like 300 people who came out to crawl with him. So throughout the years, the crawl has gained critical mass and has become a larger thing, but at the beginning it was crawling alone. And my dad had crawled with William in 2000 and something, or 2004, I think, in Montreal. William had been invited to the city, and he had done this crawl up the Chemin de Calèche, which goes up the Mount Royal. And I had not seen it, but my dad had come home totally wrecked and also like very transformed by the experience and moved by it. And I had a vivid memory of that. So I thought, okay, William's invited people to crawl. I'm going to talk about William. I'll join William on his crawl even though he's not with me. And so I thought, I'm going to crawl from my apartment to the place and then give an hour talk. It's a 2-kilometer distance. Should be able to do that in like 25 minutes, 30 minutes. Went out the night before. I found a Nordique's jersey at the Salvation Army totally by chance because I was trying to find something that would that could get destroyed because I knew my clothes would probably get wrecked. And I thought, great, I'm living in Toronto. I'm going to wear my Quebec Nordiques jersey, and I'm going to recite Roch-Carrier's Les hivers de mon enfance étaient des saisons longues, which finds itself on the $5 bill as I do this crawl. And the night before, I talked to my dad, and he said, he wasn't like giving me too much, but he was like, do you have anyone to document this? I said, no, I don't need anyone to document it. This is just like a pre-presentation. He's like, no, someone should show up. So called a friend. My friend shows up at 6 a.m., get on all fours, start crawling out of the apartment, and 45 minutes into the piece, I've made it to the corner of the street. I'm like getting totally wrecked. I've like bypassed glass and dog excrement, and I realize like, oh, this is going to be a bigger thing. And so the crawl ended up lasting 3 hours and a half. And at the end, I gave a lecture, but I'll let you sort of have a little snippet of it before I complete that story. So the cranberries is not me who added it on. It was playing. I do not add cranberries to all my performances, although that would be a thing to do. At some point, as you can tell, my body started falling apart. I started having trouble like speaking. I was dehydrated. I had taped this image of William on my head because William, I thought, would bring me, or like I should carry him with me if he's going to be present. And I decided to eat the photo at some point. It was a Xerox image, and that's in relationship to William has this performance this installation performance where he eats the Wall Street Journal sitting on top of a toilet bowl, and then he digests it drinking Pepto-Bismol, and then he, lets it out. And so I thought, and he's thinking about cannibalism and processing processing the Wall Street Journal and the representation of power in the Wall Street Journal and economics. And so I thought it a good idea to eat William to give me power to get me through the talk. But basically 3 hours later, the class was all there. They weren't there at the beginning, but they somehow showed up at some point. I ended the crawl. I got up, totally out of it, and everyone just kind of looked at me like they had just watched me crawl for 4 hours. So you can imagine the state they were in. And my teacher had watched me like crawl next to buses that were trying to cross and was a little bit in shock. And I said, okay, like, let's go. I'm going to give an hour and a half talk. Sure enough, I went upstairs and I gave an hour and a half talk, and that was a really important part for me because this research that I do, this work that I was doing was in relationship to this talk, and it was important to complete the loop because it was about that lecture. And so I went home, I was super sore, totally arms burnt up, my body was wrecked, and I had learned all these new things about the crawl and the way of being in it, and I called my dad in the bathtub, and I said, Dad, I did this thing. And he paused a little bit, and he said, that was a performance. And I thought, oh, this is what that is. I've now made a performance. And so that's kind of the beginning of how my career started after having left home and then found my own way. At the same time as I was trying to crawl to figure out how William crawled and what that meant and how I could work through his archive in that way, I was also in this other course in the Department of Performance Studies on sort of research creation or practice-based research or performance as research, depending on what granting body you're applying to. There's a different term to be used. It wasn't a class on that, but it was very much a class geared towards the sort of shift in the humanities. The shifts in the arts towards more humanities or social sciences or even a hard sciences-based research model. And being the sort of angry graduate student that I was, I felt that the instrumentalization of the arts in this context was very frustrating. And so we were asked to come up with these research creation projects, and my friends were coming up with sort of these very quantitative research methods, like what happens if I put a Twitter screen on stage and allow people to tweet while there's a performance going on, and so on. And I thought, well, if I'm going to create a research creation project, I may as well create the best research creation project, because in that case, I'm going to apply to a SSHRC grant, which was the goal of the class, to apply to a SSHRC grant. And if I get that SSHRC grant, I will have, I applied with this, I decided to create this project where I tried to walk through walls. I tried to learn how to walk through walls. Because I realized that if I learned how to walk through a wall, I would have effectively have changed the state of normal science. And that at that point, my research creation project would ultimately be the best research creation project that there ever was. And SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, would have no choice other than to basically give me the biggest SSHRC grant they've ever given. And they've given $1 million ones, so I was looking for the big money on this. So I developed this project where I literally started going to different sites in Toronto and tried to walk through different walls that I found.
Money.
No?
No, I'm just trying to walk through a wall.
Well, you'll hurt yourself that way.
No, so far I'm not too hurt.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, then.
Yeah, thank you, though. I mean, if you could give me some advice, that's all I would need.
Some advice?
Oh,
well,
yeah.
Like not to walk through the wall, because I'm studying chemistry, and in chemistry it says you can't walk through a wall.
That's not true. Latest findings are that you can walk through walls.
No,
Walls are porous.
Porous, yeah, no. Well, unless you change the composition of the wall, make it soft, make it a liquid, then it might, or a foam. That way.
So a foam or a liquid, eh?
Yeah, you could walk through that. If you change the composition of the wall, you could do it.
Really?
Yeah, and to change the composition of the wall, you know, you could do that, change that with heat it up so that it would melt.
But then I'd be breaking it.
Yeah, that'd be the only way to do it, and you'd still walk through the wall that way.
Well, I guess I'll think about that.
Okay.
I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
I have to go to work now.
Oh, enjoy. Have a good day.
So basically walking through walls started off with me having this idea and then trying to figure out how to execute this idea. And the best thing I could think about is I would literally take a walk or take my bike into Toronto, and I would find a wall and I'd think, oh, this is an interesting wall. It's like a gallery wall that's very loaded, and I grew up looking at these white walls. And I would put my camera down on the ground here, and it was a small Canon G12, not even a video camera, that only shot in sequences of 7 minutes, and so I would constantly just lose footage or miss things. And I would put the camera down, I would put my bag, and then I would just start launching myself at the wall over and over again until I either would get exhausted or like the police would show up, or I got into a situation that just felt like I needed to get out of it. And so all these people, like this woman who comes and talks to me, doesn't see a camera, doesn't really see a setup. She just sees this guy launching himself at the wall, and then she engaged me in a conversation. The first time I thought, okay, you know, this is maybe a one-time thing. And then it just kept happening over and over again. Everyone was very friendly, and when I basically would tell them, the conversation always went, what are you doing? Can I help you? And then I'd say, no, but I'm trying to walk through this wall, and then we just get into either like a 2-minute conversation or a like 60-minute conversation. Or with this woman now, it's like been a 7-year conversation because we've been emailing back and forth about how I might or might not be able to walk through a wall. And there started to be this large research component to it also, where people would send me things like, I don't know if any of you seen the movie Men Who Stare at Goats, which is based on the sort of CIA research in the 70s, where they were both doing LSD and trying to teach the military how to walk through walls. But there is this like historical precedent, either literary or scientific or military, about walking through walls. This is a very real thing that people have tried and continue to try. There's a patented mode of research, a patented way of doing it, which I've tried to like figure out, but this weird arm crossing and walking like this, and I don't know, it doesn't work well with me. But anyways, so I started to develop this large archive, making drawings, but also writing papers, theoretical papers, and doing this research around it. So it's this project that sort of took on what very early on this notion of research creation and started adapting it to my needs and my methodologies, which were dealing with the kind of possible, impossible, and what is it really that we're involving ourselves in when we start quantifying and qualifying what research is in the arts. Jump over. I said this morning that this is the first time I'm talking about Gary Neal Kennedy in Atlantic Canada, so I'm a little self-conscious about this. But after Toronto, I moved over to Vancouver, where I did an MFA, because in Toronto I was only doing a master's in art, so there was no crits, no sort of studio system. I was just making work on the street, and I thought, it'd be a good time now to like get a formal arts training. So I moved to Vancouver and started at Simon Fraser University, where I started an interdisciplinary MFA. But I was like still as angry and trying to figure out what all of this meant. Within, again, a month, there's a theme here where I like move to a place and within a month something happens and then it triggers me for the rest of my time there. But Gary Neal Kennedy came to Simon Fraser, and we had a inter-university with Emily Carr and UBC a book launch for The Last Art College, which is a book that got published by MIT Press. The presentation itself sort of was strange because we were in Simon Fraser's new complex on Hastings Street in Vancouver with these sort of 3 or 4 arts universities programs there, and we basically sat for 2 hours as we were lectured on how art colleges had ended 40 years ago, and like art had happened and we were now like too late, and there was this kind of golden moment. And I kind of stewed in this and was quite upset about it, and so decided that I would make a piece about it. And there was also this frustration with the way that, so there were multiple sort of elements that were difficult to deal with. The notion of the final art college, also the way that women artists were presented in the presentation, mostly presented as the partners of someone, as someone who was there as an accident. So a lot of the work revolved around the men who had been there, and there were fewer women in the publication itself. So I did a piece where, actually I didn't want to make a piece. I was thinking I'm not going to do anything, and then I went to the Emily Carr bookstore, and there was a copy of The Last Art College, and I said, I'll open it, and I opened the first page, and Gary Neal Kennedy had signed it and autographed it, but it was sitting in there, and I thought, okay, now I got to do something. So I got this copy, and I proceeded to eat every page on which Gary Neal Kennedy's name appeared over the period of 3 hours during a performance. As I was eating, I quickly realized that I wasn't going to be able to digest this like William Popel. This is not the Wall Street Journal. The quality of MIT Press books is much higher. This paper is thick. And I was looking at something like 60 pages, and so I was thinking, okay. So I got this little peanut butter jar that I called my last college tree, because the idea was that I would masticate it, kind of spit it back in, and then the germs would fester, and then I would grow a little tree. Then I could return it to NASCAD to commemorate the end of the last art college. Unfortunately, the tree never took, but I still have Last Art College jar. I thought of bringing it on this trip, but there's too much snow, and I was told that the ground was frozen, so I will not be going to NASCAD to plant my tree on this trip, or my jar. But ultimately, the performance was this 3-hour event where I slowly ate the pages or chewed on them and then spat them back into this, reading the pages. I used lipstick because one of the things that upset me about the publication was that Michael Snow's record piece on the front had been transformed into this silver print, and my question during the presentation was why, and the answer was because we were told it would sell more in the United States. And so I was upset about this, but then at the same time, the inside of the publication had the amazing Louis Weaver Oh Canada piece with the lipstick, and so it felt like there was a commentary to make, them being partners, and then the inside and the outside, and the gloss versus the packaging of the inside to be made. So I had lipstick that I had written every page on which his name appeared. People joined me. My colleagues ate some paper because they felt bad for me. And so this sort of like involvement with processing, this return to the idea of working through an archive through my body by quite literally eating it, regurgitating it, either shitting or throwing it back out, and processing it. Archives that are often treated with sort of delicacy and that don't necessarily always have a body present in them, and thinking about how to work through that with my own physicality. I didn't eat anything in the Monet archives. David was there to watch me and make sure that I would not. It's a good thing I didn't talk about this before I asked to go into the archives. So this idea of walking through walls also started to transform, where as my career started to develop, I started to get invited to galleries to try to walk through walls, because it was an interesting question. It was at first sort of a negotiation, but rapidly I realized that what the gallery allowed to give me was a quote-unquote safe space where I could basically be for longer than I was. Because on the street, I was always left with, it's going to start raining, or it's going to get dark, or the cops will show up, or whatever. Whereas at the gallery, I could create an environment and transform that environment, and it not just be this, gray wall that I'm bashing myself against and that I'm writing with chalk. So the first iteration of this was walking through walls at the Catherine Mulheron Gallery. Catherine Mulheron, who's since passed, and who was really important because she gave me my first exhibition and really sort of gave me the run of the gallery when I had never done this before, and it was quite a daunting task. And so from sunrise to sunset, after having had an exhibition in the space with all of my body of walking through walls of like drawings I'd made and research I'd had and conversations, I did this performance in the glass, in the window front, where I basically had people coming off the street and talk to me about the possibility of it and what it made them think about, or a Simpsons reference that they thought about Homer fading out through the grass or whatever. And I started developing for the first time this kind of mark making on glass, writing on text. Writing text on glass and allowing it to transfer through the space and to create this sort of palimpsest and accumulation of knowledge in performance. In the space behind the glass, there were drawings that had been generated throughout the archive of walking through walls. The year, actually, Mulheron was the year after, but the year before, what kind of had spurred this was that I had done a performance during Nuit Blanche in Toronto, the sort of overnight bonanza festival, at the Whippersnapper Art Gallery. For those who don't know, the Whippersnapper was this very small window front gallery that's no bigger than the size of that screen up until the projection. And then it's got a whole glass, floor to ceiling that gives right on Dundas or Spadina. Anyways, Dundas, yeah. Drawing a blank. Thank you. And during Nuit Blanche, you just have like hundreds of thousands. Like literally hundreds of thousands of drunk people and high people walking through, like looking for art. And so I took this space, which at the beginning of the night was entirely white, this white cube, white walled gallery, because they were in between shows. And I had like 7 pieces of willow sticks. And the performance started with me marking a large, walking through walls, making a large line. And then by the end of the evening, which was 12 hours, so 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., or by the next morning, I guess, the space kind of looked like this, and I was totally bruised up and covered and cut and whatever. And throughout the evening, I basically just spoke to people about the project and launched myself at the wall over and over again and tried to walk through walls and bring people to walk through walls with me. Nuit Blanche is the context where, like, at 3 a.m., when I was really tired and not quite feeling or like questioning why I was doing this, 2 guys walk into the space in full suits, very crisp, but on LSD. And I'm like covered in this soot, and I'm drawing on the walls, and I've got to figure out And I'm trying to walk through walls, and they're looking at me, and I'm like, okay, how do I not have them bad trip? How do I get them out of here? But at the same time, how do I engage them? Because this is kind of an interesting moment. It's like a very tense relational space. But I had like the most amazing interaction with them because they got really into how it was faith or fate, and which of the two it was, faith or fate. And then we wrote that on the walls and debated the difference between faith or fate and how walking through walls was related to that. And then at some point one of them backed up against the wall. And I was like, oh, don't do that with your crisp white shirt. And sure enough, he had all of this willow on his back. And I was like, oh, you have? And he turned around to me and he said, no, it's beautiful, man. Now I'm going to take this with me and I'll never wash this shirt again. And I just thought, thank you, LSD dudes, for making this evening like this wonderful. Again, this idea of transference, of like embodied spaces, of transferring knowledge, of transforming ideas, the way that the space accumulated the event. There was a projection, not a projection, there was a small TV, an old body TV that had a camera up in the space that was pointed out towards the outside street, and what it created is this white cube within a white cube. So there's also this mise en abîme of the space as it imploded on itself and got smaller and smaller. In Vancouver, I started to develop again, thinking about my relationship to performance art, and especially the performance art I had been raised looking at because of my parents. Marina Abramovich had this piece called The Artist is Present, where she was at MoMA and people waited for hours to go see her, and I thought, this was ridiculous, she wasn't present at all. So I decided to make a work where I would not really be much in the gallery, but kind of around it, inviting people to make the work with me and for me at Simon Fraser University over the period of a week at the Audin Gallery, giving out on Hastings. And again, this idea of materiality was super important. I was transcribing notes on conceptual art on this floor, and playing with the notions of presence and unpresence and performance, especially performance as it exists now in sort of a spectacle, but also as it exists in galleries as like fodder at an opening, or as a kind of like entertainment, or as it exists in the sort of MoMA case with Marina Abramovich as a star system, where an artist just gets to sit there and pee through her chair for an hour and like have people sit at her, and then there's these videos made of it that are super aestheticized. And so what does that mean? So this piece sort of played with those ideas. I was also, through that, sort of developing a new relationship to materiality and objects. This is a performance during the Montreal Nuit Blanche, during specifically Art Souterrain, which is a festival that happens entirely underground. I had this idea that I would, during all of it, again, like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., try to walk in the opposite direction of an escalator. So as the escalator was coming down, I would try to walk up. And in my like conceptual mind, because at the heart I am a conceptual artist who has these very clean ideas where it's just going to be like a nail in the wall and we're going to call it the piece. I thought that's all I'm going to do the whole time, and it's going to be very stoic. And I got to the performance and I started the action, and like 5 minutes into it I realized, oh my God, this is so hard. I'm never going to be able to do this beyond like the first 15 minutes, because I don't really rehearse, I don't really try these things out. A lot of it is about the reality of the moment and the unpredictable, and being able to move with the material and figuring out new situations. And so I was sort of forced in that moment to make a bunch of decisions, which were how to deal with this context, which is I was performing inside of the World Exchange in Montreal, how to deal with this festival context with all these people. And so I started taking some of the material I had bought at Home Depot a couple of hours before to wrap up the piece, and using it in this kind of like expanded material presence and creating new situations for myself. It's also a good piece to illustrate that the work that I tend to do is relational, but not relational in a way that is necessarily predetermined. It's always funneled through me as a body and as an agent who controls the situation, because that's just the reality of the power situation when I'm making work, or when anyone's making work really. But I'm interested in someone offering something like a new object or an idea or this is shit or whatever as a potential for going somewhere else with it. And that evening was basically a bunch of bouncing back and forth. Someone said, oh, you look like the fountain. So I moved over to the fountain and created this kind of like fountain structure figure. And I was giving out these little circles that everyone started to wear and started to dissipate through the evening, and then told by other people, oh, I saw someone with an orange thing like 8 kilometers away. So the piece kind of carried itself. It's also around this period that I started to rethink the way that I had been working with documentation of performances. Along with dealing with the legacy of performance art that I'm dealing with, I'm also very aware of the ease with which performance art now circulates and creates aestheticized images that anyone can do, because there's a nostalgia for the kind of like 70s and 60s performance, but also like the quality of cameras that we all have and the sort of cinematic eye that we've all grown up and developed with allows for there to be a lot of this like sort of set performances. So I started to rethink the way that I was presenting my documentation or even thinking about performances. So this is a residency in Windsor in a space that was called Broken City Lab that closed. But I was there at the University of Windsor doing a residency for a month where I did basically like 40, 60 performances. Every day I would just go out and do performances and document them with my camera again. And instead of then showing the kind of final product at the exhibition, I made a book of 120 or so pages that documented that process in a kind of cut and paste DIY using preview, not even InDesign at the time or like any Photoshop or anything, just kind of like cut and paste preview what I could do. That I presented as a wall piece, as this kind of like continuous. So this is a grid that was mounted in the gallery with the entire book laid out. And on the right, you can see kind of a sample. This is a sample of a conversation I had with someone who was asking me about what I was doing when I was trying to walk through a wall. This is a performance, or there's a bunch of intercut action, but basically the action on the bottom there is that when I first went to Windsor, someone said to me, oh, or when I was first going to Windsor, someone said to me, oh, you're going to be in Windsor, it's a stone throws away from Detroit. And when I got to Windsor, I was like, well, it's not a stone throws away, or what does that mean? And so I did a piece where I did a mound of stones and tried to throw stones at Detroit continuously, and then people would come by and be like, what are you doing? And I'd be like, well, I'm throwing stones at Detroit. So me and a bunch of people would start throwing stones at Detroit in a hope to reach it by throwing. These are just some other close-ups of that book. And well, yeah, you can kind of tell from the photos, but the pages are just like small novel size, page book, postcard size almost. I also became obsessed at that time with Donald Rumsfeld's unknown knowns and known knowns and what's unknown and known, and play on that, the stickers. It was also that sort of aesthetic of moving the performance into collage and playing around with that was also at the same time happening with video aesthetic. So if I could do that with the still images, why not do that with the video images and transform those? So during a residency in Skagastran in Iceland, in Ness, I kind of lost my mind after being in a fishing village with 50 people after 1 week, and focused on this one project where I did 5 videos over 5 weeks. At the end of each week of doing a series of performances, I would make a video that lasted 5 minutes. That was my parameters, and created this very dense archive, new series of videos that I was working with. So I'll show one of those videos and then give a little more context. One, two, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3.
refer to the kind of art in which I am involved as gravity. In gravity, the idea or gravity is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a gravity form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art.
So the project in Iceland started off with a week of not knowing what I was doing, of feeling very isolated in this tiny fishing village, and of trying to walk through walls and trying to figure out what I was going to do with this, and of then late one night walking between my house and another house because all the artists were sort of divided up in these different homes, and throwing up this stone in the air. And at some point I threw up the stone and it came down and hit me right in the face, and I thought, I'm pretty good at throwing stones. Something's wrong with this. So I went on Google, as all good researcher does, and looked at Iceland gravity. And sure enough, Iceland has the lowest field of gravity on the planet, which means that things fall faster there. And New Zealand having the highest one, meaning that things fall the least fast there. So I thought, this is excellent. I will spend my time in Iceland trying to determine how I can transfer that, how we can feel that Iceland, that things fall faster. So the sort of the performances all revolved around this notion of gravity and the gravitational pull of my own head towards the earth in sort of this series of 5 videos, with walking through walls, making an appearance, and other things, because I realized that was inherently also still in a way linked to gravity. It's also throughout this process of working with video and working with installation and collage and performance that I realized that one of the things that was always present and super important for me after the performances was the sound element of what I was doing. And sometimes the sound element was totally not central to anyone else, or not quite realized, whether it was the sound of me rubbing up against a wall during the performance, or the sound of my body hitting something and creating the impact. I was really interested in the way that sound is a material, and when I hit the wall, the energy moves through the wall and potentially moves through that wall. Actually, someone who works with sound had talked to me about that as a possibility, that the sound of me was actually moving through the wall every time I hit it. So I started to focus more on finding ways to materialize this sound beyond by giving it some kind of electroacoustic resonance in the space and bringing it out and focusing on it. So one of the pieces I made with a friend of mine who I was doing my MFA, who's also a visual artist, Clint Sleeper, was this U-Haul punk party outside of a gallery. And I call it a punk party because when I look at this and then I look at a lot of the work after, I realized that I think I was just always wanted to be in a band when I was growing up, and I was never good enough to be in the band, so now I've just reinvented myself as a front man to my own performances, making bad, noisy music, but this is sort of to give a taste of that. So the U-Haul has been transformed using contact microphones all over it, and different sensors that are activating loops, but also just the U-Haul is sounding through the contact microphones that are placed in The gallery that we were performing in is a performance art, explicitly a performance art gallery in Chicago named Defibrillator Art Gallery. That before I moved to Chicago, or at this point I've moved to Chicago from Vancouver to start my PhD in performance studies, in terms of the timeline of when these things are happening. When I moved to Chicago, the gallery was in one space, and by the time I had been invited to do my first performance there, it had moved twice already, and now it actually doesn't have a space anymore. It's kind of been priced out of all the spaces it had. And so the piece that Clint and I made was on the anniversary of the second or third move of it. And so the U-Haul was kind of in reference to the precarity of finding spaces in Chicago, and specifically finding spaces to present performance, because there are very few spaces like Defibrillated that have this kind of mandate and that support artists. And the curator, director, he does everything, Joseph Ravens, was fantastic in facilitating this project. So as you can see, there was a live feed in the space going on while we were doing this. It was also on Halloween, so people like showed up and jumped in there with costumes, and it kind of got pretty wild. So at some point, some kids came trick-or-treating. We had candy handed to the kids and made it a little festive. But there's a lot of the work, especially the walking through walls, but also a lot of the work people sort of ask me about if I'm into pain and like destroying my body, and why I'm into that, and what does that mean, and sort of like create links between my work and artists who explicitly use sort of either like blood work or kind of like, inflicting pain on themselves. And I make a distinction because I am definitely interested in endurance and enduring and induration, but as a process that allows things to happen over time and things to degrade or to come together, or to actually degrade and then come together, and sort of this sort of process of entropy. But I'm not really interested in pain itself as a thing, and like I never place myself in a situation that I think I'm going to hurt myself in deliberately, or even potentially, because when I was a kid I didn't skateboard because I was so afraid that I would hurt myself, and I didn't like riding a bike. I didn't like skating. There's a lot of things I didn't like because I was afraid I would hurt myself. But every once in a while there's a situation where those things manifest themselves. I was invited to do a piece in an abandoned bank in Lexington, Kentucky, and I had been in conversations about recent performances, including the one in the U-Haul with my partner and my father and my mother also, who had told me that I rush a little bit in my performances and that I needed to slow things down. So I approached this piece with a different pace, thinking about my body, and I had come up with this incredibly gentle action, working with an object, which is another thing that I'm interested in, just objects as a thing, as a material, like an architecture or a structure, where I would basically blow these balloons, party balloons, and scream into them and apply a bit of pressure against a surface, and then they would explode, like they would blow up until they blow up. So I did this for like 3 hours, and it was going super well, and I finally got to the concrete floor, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be great. So I blew up the piece, I blew up the balloon, and the first one went fine. I thought, oh, this is like perfect. I can do a nice solid hour of like just working through this material. It's super interesting. And I started blowing the second, and the balloon was a little tough, and it wasn't going, and I like started to get up, and then as I was getting up, the balloon let go, and I smashed my face right into the concrete floor and broke my nose. And of course started bleeding, as one does, and just like stopped the performance, much to the chagrin of another performance artist who was there. It was like, you never stop. And I was like, screw that. Performance is flexible. If I have to pee in the middle of a performance, I go pee. Like, this is very much me in a performance and not in a performance. There is no rule here. The performance is happening when I want it to happen. It's happening in continuous, and there's no being precious about it. So we stopped. This is a photo of my girlfriend calling our insurance company to figure out if they covered broken noses in Kentucky for me. We ended up at the ER, and thankfully Lexington is a frat boy town, so they just thought that I had gotten a little rowdy with the beer pong. Came back the next day and kept making the work because I was fine and I could do it. I still have a little bump on my nose. My nose had broken into place, so I was fine to go. But the reason to talk about this has to do with the unpredictability and like the notion of improvisation and working with what comes, but also being okay with ending something and dealing with it and improvising with it and going with the flow. But also because this is a good occasion to sort of talk through the things that structure my performances. There is the notion of context in architecture. Then there's an important element that's either historical, so if there's a performance that I'm told is happening on like November 3rd for a festival, I sort of do a quick research as to what happens in November 3rd and then work through the archive and try to materialize some interesting intersections. And then the other thing is that sometimes I'm just interested by material. So for this performance, I decided to work with 7 objects. I knew that milk would be interesting, and I just thought milk, what goes well with milk? Billy boots, a nice pair of rain boots, and then balloons, and I forget what the other objects were. But I ended the piece with my Van Gogh red ear painted with lipstick. Oh, that was the other object. My milk boots, and did a moonwalk with this. So just thinking through material differently as a potential for creation. This is another piece where, again, bringing the elements of sound. I was interested in the sound that the earth makes. This is during a residency at Acre, which is in Wisconsin, but has a presentation space in Chicago. And I know there are mostly students here, but Acre is a really good space to get residency in right after being a student or right as you're transitioning out. So if any of you are interested, you should let me know, and I can put you in touch with the people, because they basically have like 60 people, 60 residents over 3 sessions in the summer, and it's all run by volunteers, and it's just a fantastic creative space. But anyways, I made this piece where I was reflecting on the sound that the earth makes as it rotates on its own axis. So I made a video very much in line with the videos I was making in Iceland. I made a series of silkscreen prints of me performing the kind of listening to the earth, and so thinking again about the ways of presenting performances and what are the alternative ways than the sort of image of me lying in the grassy field. And then a large drawing that was made during one of those performances where I was listening to the ground, thinking about the material and the research I was creating. And then the installation had these blue painted oranges that slowly rotted towards green, sort of my little globes of earth. And of course, the gallery loved having rotting food in their space over the period of time. That's a close-up of the drawing that was up in the wall in one of the blue oranges. There's also, around this time, an exhibition that opened at the Northwestern University Art Gallery on the artist, the Fluxus artist Charlotte Moorman, who is pictured right here, who's a super important artist who is most well known, if you like see her in an intro class or whatever, for these pieces that she did with her cello. She was a cello player, but she played it nude. This was the kind of transgressive, and then she made a bunch of other works around the cello and music. But she was a really important organizer in New York, performance festivals and Fluxus festivals. And so I was asked, and with 2 other people, to create reenactments for the a festival around the exhibition that was happening at the University Art Gallery at Northwestern, at the Block Museum. And so this is sort of to talk about my relationship to reperformance and reenactment. I see reenactment, reperformance, redoing, reactivation, whatever you want to sort of add to it, as this kind of process-based work that I'm always engaged with, whether it's a Colville painting, or whether it's Charlotte Moorman, or whether it's the first man walking on the moon, or whether it's my dad's archive, or whether it's the time that I first walk and put earth in my mouth. And so I approached this work, while the 2 other people who had been approached to do that did this kind of more reenactment of Trio A by Yvonne Rainer. I took a score by an artist who was a contemporary and a friend of Charlotte Moorman, Jeff Hendricks, who had this score that had never been made, because it was one of these Fluxus scores that wasn't actualized, and it was Erase Everything. And I thought, perfect, like, talk about a great score, Erase Everything, what am I going to do with that? So I wrote to Jeff, and I was like, is this okay? And Jeff wrote me a very nice handwritten note that said, I hope you realize I've never made this work. And I said, yes, that's excellent. I'm glad you've never made it. I will now reenact it. So the piece was basically, oh yes, I need to introduce a 3rd character to the triad. Charlotte Moorman, Jeff Hendricks, and then there's Georgeson-Usher, who was a member of Fluxus and kind of the grandfather of Fluxus in many ways, who was friends with all of them, but created these lists of genealogies. Of course, I'm interested in genealogy and lineage, and these were lists of genealogies that had basically what he considered to be the history of performance art, or the history of performance as a thing. And they would start with, whatever the first what he saw as the first 20th century Dada, et cetera, the Café Voltaire, and then they would go to the 1970s, and there would be hundreds of people in them, but none of them would never include Charlotte Moorman in them because to him, she did not belong to this, and it's personal, professional. He kind of excluded her, and he created multiple genealogies and excluded her multiple times, and people have written and discussed this. So I thought this is an excellent opportunity to recreate George Eunice's genealogy. So this is I remade one using chalk on photo backdrop paper. I opened it up in the space and then basically proceeded to tie balloons to my feet as an homage to Charlotte. Blue balloons because Jeff Hendricks's practice is has a large component of it, which is painting things sky blue. And then erasing the entire history, his genealogy, and completing the gesture, as you can see on the left, by writing, once everything had been erased, by writing Charlotte Moorman into that history. And then wrapping myself up in the paper, creating this very large, sort of like 10-foot figure and walking out of the space. I don't know if I walked out. I did something. So again, this relationship to genealogy, to lineage, to history, to this history of performance art that I inscribe myself in, but have also trying to figure out my own position within. And then this reenactment as a kind of process. All right, move towards the end of these things. Within the same line, I was again invited to Concordia University to do a project in their sightings cube, which sits inside of the Weber building, Hall building, across from the Weber building, which is this cube in this I'll just show the cube, which is much easier. It's like a 8 by 8 by 8 cube that stands in the gallery, outside of the gallery space, and that people use for projects. And so I decided to take an object from the archive, which is Robert Filiou's Teaching and Learning as Performing Arts, which is Robert Filiou, also a member of Fluxus, which was this reflection on performance as a vector for education and pedagogy, in which he interviews a lot of people, mostly all men, again, and engaging people with this, people around the Concordia atrium over the period of a week as I lived in this space between the hours of 10 and 7 p.m. or so on the question of teaching and performing as arts. The building sits in the middle of this atrium, the cube sits in the middle of this atrium that mostly has people coming out of economics classes and like programming classes. It's not the arts building. So I was engaging, like at some point in between classes, there was this like mass of like 200 people, and then sometimes there was no one. But it was great because Robert Filiou has a PhD in economics, or had a PhD in economics. He's also passed. So I could use that as a kind of like lure to talk to people about teaching and learning as performing arts. And one of the cover of the book, or the edition of the cover of the book I had, was yellow. So a unifying theme quickly became yellow things, and people started to just leave yellow objects for me and sort of deliver yellow things. So I accumulated this mass of yellow objects and started to slowly transform them and create new objects with them. So Juicy Fruit became Filiou Fruit. And Joseph Boys became Joseph Boys. Well, Boys, yeah, like the Joseph Boys Club. And the week of performance culminated with me taking everything that had been donated and everything I had brought into the space and wrapping it up in this large ball, which was bigger than my arms, about this big, and placing it in the middle of the space and leaving it for the duration of the exhibition. So collapsing the archive of the exhibition, the archive of this generative process around Filiou's oeuvre, and leaving it sit as this record of this action that happened over a week, over its longer period. And again, you can see the sort of palimpsest and the writing on the walls and the kind of nature of that also as I was communicating with people through the glass and doing different actions. At some point, I discovered GIFs, can never remember which one is which, and thought, wow, these are great things. I don't have to make videos, and I can just let these play in performances. And they have this like very strange, monotone, repetitive form. And they work really well with the kind of aesthetic that I'm going for. So this was a series of GIFs made for, sorry, I just started reading myself, and it got really confusing. Okay, stop reading. Yes, so a series of GIFs in which I was sort of thinking about the Expo 1967 and so this is the burning dome, the burning Buckminster Fuller Dome juxtaposed with the building of the Olympic Stadium. And the whole piece was about concrete and béton in Montreal, and what is the sound of concrete, and what is the feeling of concrete, and what is the legacy of concrete, because I have a concrete fetish, and so I was trying to work through those issues. And at the top is me in a performance, documentation of a performance silhouette. The piece had many elements in it. As you can tell, I set off with a very tight, in my mind, I'm like a very straight conceptualist, with like a chair and the description of a chair, but then everything gets really messy. So the piece had a very simple element at the beginning, and then it got very complicated, but I realized that using microphones and using contact mics and just raw mics, I could record the sound that my bones make by hitting them in different parts. So the piece had this element of like bending wire, which is a reference to the kind of like concrete surfaces in the support, bending concrete, miking it up, and making musique concrete music in the space. And that's an egg in my mouth, because I was thinking about the Bucky Dome and the kind of fragility of it. This is another GIF of my face in the dome. And that's from the performance where I broke my nose. So transferring the archive and moving it through, animating it, reworking it. All right, I'm moving towards almost done, and talk about, this is just to, I was invited to Mountain Standard Time, and I've been, again, in relationship to art history, sort of raised with this infatuation for land art, and had traveled to a lot of land art sites, and at some point I stole a stone from Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, and had been carrying it for 3 years, and I thought, I gotta make a land art piece. So I was invited to Calgary in November, and I thought, great, I'm gonna make an outdoor piece. And they were like, are you sure you wanna make an outdoor piece? It's November. And I was like, it'll be fine. Sure enough, no other artist made an outdoor piece, and it snowed the night before my performance, like really snowed. So 3 people showed up who I was living with, but I made this piece that was a reflection on land art. And land art as a claim to land, specifically in the 60s and 70s, but a continuous claim to land that is displaced when we think about decolonizing space and colonial space, and what does it mean as an artist to claim a large swath of land in the middle of the desert or wherever, and to make a work and claim that as a space. So Calgary has this fort at the very end of town, which is this, celebrated as the kind of like the edge of Canada, where the Mounties, and is essentially a site of genocide and a site of sort of colonial celebration, and has this piece there that does engage with notions of decolonizing and colonialism, but then I was trying to reflect around Calgary also has issues around public art and colonialism. So thinking about the ways that claims to public space and claims to land in art are problematic, and how can performance do that. So essentially, there were a few actions, but the main one was I tied Robert Smithson's stone to a contact mic and dragged it through Calgary's snow fields. And it made this like sound as I went around. I also had a piece of rebar, and it made a bunch of actions throughout the space over the course of 3 hours, including snow angels. Someone made this gift for me. So to wrap up, moving towards the project here, as I discussed this notion of working through archives through kind of print media and reworking of historical archives and merging them with mine. This is a piece that was done at PDA in Ottawa, which is a space that's closed, which is in an old juice bar. In this showed documentation from a performance I did at a festival in Toronto, 7A11D, a few years before, and reworked it with all of the reference material that I was citing in that performance, but that performance was way too dense for anyone to get any of that. So I thought the documentation was an opportunity to bring that. So Vito Acconci, John Baldessari, Linda Dornan can attest to the fact that it was way too dense for any of those elements to come out. She was also there performing. It was a long durational piece. So in here, it's all images of me in that performances, and then combined with Joseph Beuys and all those elements. And so thinking through that collage. This is an installation that was made on a wall as a mural. And this is a next iteration of that, which was instead of taking a shot at John Baldessari and so on, I'd take a shot at my dad. So this is me merging that performance with my dad's archive of performances. which is both frightening because you start to also see the way that our bodies are similar as we perform, and we have a similar vocabulary, although mine is much more dancerly. Anyways, so this was in the context of an exhibition on Eugene Meatyard at the Lexington Art Gallery. And Eugene Meatyard photographed his kids and made these sort of very strange, almost grotesque photos of them wearing masks, that very very awkward, queer sort of images. And so in the ground floor, there's this show upstairs in the ground floor, a bunch of artists sort of were working with family and filiation. So I made this collage series with my documentation and my dad. And then my dad and I performed a little sort of 30-minute piece across the space. So that's kind of a combination of both of our performance vocabularies, because I very much think about performance through the notion of vocabulary. I have a vocabulary, and it comes out in performance in multiple ways, and I articulate it. And I'm very comfortable, and sometimes I add in new words or new things, and that's what throws me off. And so I think this is a good testament to my dad's belt heads, which is his vocabulary, the covering of the face, which I guess he also uses, but it's hard to tell who started that trend. I think it's more me. The one sock, the bare feet, so it's kind of an intermingling of that. So before getting to the Owens, to give a context for what you'll be seeing on Friday, if you come to the opening, I did a piece a couple months ago at the Montreal Museum of Contemporary Art called Strike Zone, Zone de Prise, in the context of a festival. I was thinking about 60 years of the expos, and the piece was quite basic. I had 42 baseball bats for the 42 expos that were on the original roster. And my dad and I took 2 of the sculptures from his studio, which are from a series of sculptures he made with hats in the mid-2000s, these hats with wires. And we walked them from his studio down Ontario Street, a couple of kilometers, to the MAC. And we got to the MAC, and at the time, the MAC was in a labor strike because the employees of the MAC have not had a contract for 5 years. And so to show support for them, I took bats out and circled the space and wore the colors of the strike, of the union. And then once these actions were done, I went into the space and created a series of actions using baseball bats, chewing gum, all this sort of like popcorn, all these sort of references to baseball, and activating the baseballs through sound. And I brought one of the baseball bats, which was one of the main sound elements. Let's see if this works, and I don't. So transforming one of the bats, which will be relevant on the show Friday, into a sound device, into a contact lens, into an object to be dragged, or an object to just my back. And one of the sort of magical things about handing 45 baseball bats to people in a museum is that they're very well disciplined. I thought maybe they would break all the art or start taking swings at each other, but everyone was very disciplined. But there were a few people who I found in the documentation after sort of giving me their best poses, their best baby boots. They're really good for dragging and moving around. So from that, we complete with Alex Colville's Athletes. As Emily said, we met a year ago at a conference, and Emily said, I've got this painting and I'd like to make something to sort of, around it. And as you can tell, I had never worked with painting, mostly worked with sort of my history, which is like conceptual art, performance art, which is why when you first said, I was like, well, what am I going to do? But I thought, Gary Neal Kennedy, I have worked with painting. I do know what to do. No, I as soon as I saw the painting, I thought immediately, this is excellent. There are so many performative elements. It's so performative. There's so much body. There's so much action. There's so much of my work in there. There's so much for me to re-engage with and rethink. And so through that process, there was kind of a 2-part process, which was figuring out whether to approach it in a sort of curatorial framing function or whether to approach it as an artist and as a writer, which are kind of the hats that I keep juggling and thinking through. And then I thought, why not do it as all of them? And so I pitched the idea to Emily, and Emily said, sure, let's do that. So one of the main components of the show has been to invite Eunice Bélidor, who's the director of the Art Gallery at Concordia, and Camille Georgeson-Usher, who is now the director of the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective and also a PhD student at Queen's University, to write 2 texts that either engage the work directly, Eunice's text engage the work more directly, or just is a reflection on art and sports more broadly as an interesting intersection because of their physicality or whatever, just kind of as a conversation starter. Because throughout of all these works, what I said at the beginning is that I mostly like to do sports. And my dream is really to be a professional athlete on top of being a frontman for a band. And so I've always trying to find ways to interlace these two, and this has been sort of the first opportunity to do that explicitly. And so Eunice and Camille have written 2 beautiful texts that recontextualize both the work and rethink the way that we think about art and sports in contemporary Canada and North America more broadly. And I know both of them. It was important to me to have a link, and I know both of them through running. That's the way that our connection happens, and I really respect their work and love their writing. And then on my end, I sort of created a bunch of works in reference to the Colville archive, but also the Mount A University archive. And I won't say too much about it, because you've got to come back and see. But one of the sort of main things was to work through the archive, and I found this great photo of Alex Colville standing in front of the painting when it was inaugurated at the Athletic Center in 1961. So you have to imagine that the original photo had the painting there, and created a series of images where for the first time really my body is not present, but I'm thinking about someone else's body and a historical body, and not a performance artist's body, but a painter's body, and its relationship to space and movement and performativity, and thinking about the painting itself and the way that it functions with that. So those are just sort of 2 teasers for what'll be on Friday. And so the exhibition is a combination of Eunice and Camille's texts and the original painting, and then interventions I've made in both the university archives and the Owens Art Gallery archives. That's been supported by everyone who I thanked at the beginning of this. So I should also finish before we do the Q&A, by thanking my parents who are here, who drove with me from Montreal through a 3-day snowstorm last weekend, and who listened to me give this talk in French this morning and have now listened to it in English. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for being here. Thanks. Oh, that's a great question. No one's ever asked me that. Thank you. I'd really like to talk about my rituals before my performance, but no one wants to know. I do, now that you ask. I take my phone and my wallet out of my pockets. I remove my belt. Sometimes I don't, and I regret it, because I do a lot of rolling and rubbing, and a belt, the metal strap, is always very painful. I usually take off jewelry, because I know that I'm going to smash it, or I take off my watch. So there's a big process of removing things. Sometimes I listen to Carly Rae Jepsen or Beyonce or some kind of pump-up music, and then it gets me really anxious, and then I have to turn it off. But there has to be a phase where I'm going to listen to pump-up music, because I kind of approach it the way that I used to approach sports, in which I used to do that. But that's kind of part of the ritual, the up and down. A while back, I saw a video on power posing. And my girlfriend was like, you gotta try this. And then I tried it, and now I power pose before any type of event. I power pose before in the hallway there. No, I don't even need a mirror anymore. I just need to power pose before. So I definitely do a power pose. That's important. Turn my phone off, silence it. I usually text my partner and tell her, I'm about to do this thing. I'll text you when it's over, because when she's not there, she's let me know it's gone okay. And then usually I try to do a mental run through of what I need to do. So as you can maybe tell, I go into these performances not knowing what I'm going to do, or knowing roughly what I'm going to do. I know what the objects are, I know what my vocabulary is, but everything is kind of open-ended and everything is possible. and that's by design, but also like just part of the programming of who I am. So before the performances, usually there's a long process where I'm painful, and my parents can tell you about this, and my partner can tell you about it, where I'm thinking like, what am I gonna do, what am I gonna do? Maybe I should do this, maybe I should do this. And so I always think like, okay, I'm gonna write it out, I'm gonna rehearse it, I'm gonna do it. So right before the performance, in the lead up, there's often a moment where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write out 10 things that I need to remember, because I feel like I can remember 10 things. And then I try to memorize them like 5 minutes before. And usually I remember 2, or like the first one I memorized. So that's definitely an important part of the process, is trying to think like, what is it you're doing? Like, what are the important things? And trying to refocus on them. And then usually forgetting them as soon as I've like started whatever I'm doing. Going to the bathroom, super important. As I said before, I don't mind going to the bathroom midway, but like, there's nothing like doing a handstand, or like being on the floor and throwing yourself, or like really finding your groove and then being like, I should have peed. Because I've also been drinking water all day because I'm nervous and I know I'm gonna like need to be hydrated like an athlete or a rock star. And so, yeah, definitely going to the bathroom, and going to the bathroom multiple times leading up to it, where like why have I gone to the bathroom 6 times in the last like 10 minutes? But like, it's just to make sure that I'm okay. And I wish I could tell you teching was important, but it really isn't, and that's a problem, and it's been an issue repeatedly, where like I'll get to the performance. This happened in November at the MAC, where it was like, you're in a museum, you're gonna get this right this time, like don't screw. And I had really thought things out, and sure enough, the first thing I went to do was to start the AM/FM radio, and it didn't work because the batteries were dead. And it was just like that moment of like, you should have probably tech this right before. So it's not really, I try to do everything, but because I'm like this one-man show that's trying to organize and run all these things, it gets hard to manage all of that. I think those are all the important rituals that I have. That might have been more than you were asking for, but that's basically everything, almost. That's super interesting. Thank you. I feel like that was as both a personal and an artistic analysis, and they're both very apt, and so I thank you for that. The quote about a process, art is a machine, is Saul Lewitt's Notes on Conceptual Art. And in that video, I've used a robot voice to replace gravity for art or something. It gets back to what I was saying about like feeling and being raised and thinking that I'm like a staunch conceptualist, and that I'm going to make work that is literal, and that is tight in that way, and that is not messy, and that is not chaotic. And so and I think this also has to do with my background in research, because I write and I'm doing a PhD that's almost purely theoretical. And so I approach these propositions and these images, like the image of Colville, with the desire to just put a frame and call it a day, because I love that aesthetic. When I walk into a room of like good conceptual art, I get this feeling like no other. And so I set out with that intention, and then what happens is I'm like given way too much time with myself and the work, which is exactly what you've described. Like I just have what starts off as one piece just launches into everything else, and there's this kind of chaos that ensues, that is like this like cracking open of the box, and it's spiritual, and it's research based, and it's dream led, and it's personal, and it's all encompassing, and I don't make any really distinctions in it when it happens. It just kind of like is porous and happens, and it's all part of the process, which is I think why I was talking about it as a vocabulary, because it just becomes part of a language that I embody and do. And so that process then leads to this like wide opening, and you can see that I think in the objects where they like come out really wide, or in the performances where I start off the performance and there's a cup and a popcorn, and then in the middle like the cup's been shattered into a million pieces and the popcorn's in my mouth, and like someone's standing on a chair, and there's a bunch of things going on. But then at the end, there's always a desire to like, or at some point at least, there's always a desire in me to curve back and to come back to a point. Because I think that for me, the knowledge gets created like in that flux between coherence and incoherence, in the like transition moments, but also in the crystallizing moments between that. So at some point in a performance, there's always a moment where I think I gotta clean up. And clean up doesn't mean like make order, but it just means make new order in whatever I've broken apart. So the cup in 1,000 pieces will now get lined up on the wall one by one in the kind of like order, and the popcorn will take a new form. So this idea of knowledge happening through this process of expansion and contraction, and the reassemblage is super important, because I think that is the kind of like and sometimes they're conceptual juxtapositions, but sometimes they're just physical juxtapositions. Like they don't necessarily exist. They exist in multiple. There's sometimes sound juxtapositions or sound with image, and the kind of happy accidents that get created are definitely the process of that contraction and expansion, of working from the idea and then letting the idea get corroded and broken apart, but then finding other pieces of the idea, and then ultimately, like, desiring and wanting to come back to that original idea to see the whole. And even though I'm aware that like the whole is never quite there, but there's always a container, whether it's a cube, whether it's a glass frame, there's always a way that I try to like encapsulate it. But as I think in total you look at what I do, it's constantly pouring over to the next thing over and over again. I mean, I'm carrying these baseball bats for the next 20 years. Like, I'm very excited about them. I'm not letting go of them, And so that idea is just going to keep generating, and it's just going to keep changing and taking on new form and moving forward in its sort of process. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you. I'm doing a PhD at Northwestern University, which is in Chicago, Illinois, in performance studies. So very similar to the master's I had done at U of T. But the performance studies strand that I'm in at Northwestern is a sort of more of an anthropology language-based one, not a theater-based one like the one I was at U of T, which is more aligned with the NYU model. No need to get into those details. But ultimately what that means for me is that I'm in a department with people who are looking at performance and performativity not at all necessarily through the arts. Like they're looking at in my cohort, I have a friend who's doing work on queer nightlife in northern Canada, and so he's looking at those spaces. So it's very interdisciplinary, and it's meant that I've had to move out of my own practice and move out of the visual arts even from a methodological standpoint. So my dissertation is a historically grounded one that looks at the relationship between performance art and architecture in New York City and Los Angeles between 1970 and 1985, specifically how artists use their body to subvert architectural functionalism through kinesthetic actions like crawling, climbing, William being one of the objects of study, falling, these different embodied gestures. That work is mostly done through a dance studies lens and through partially an ethnographic lens to a certain extent, and an urban studies lens. So thinking about performance art through movement studies as opposed to aesthetics or cultural studies or art history even. And then my practice factors in because I find myself at the weird intersection, as I was saying at the beginning, of like existing as an artist with a PhD or artist getting a PhD, and what does that mean? And for me, it was important that the PhD not be about my practice. And there were some pressures and some conversations about centering my practice, and that was not what I wanted. But my practice becoming a tool and a methodological tool to think about works in interesting ways. So I use my practice at the beginning of my 3 chapters to either crawl you into the chapter, either occupy into the chapter, or either fall into the chapter. And it's Emily and I, before we're talking about in the 250-page whatever, it's the total of like 10 pages. But I'm realizing that for people, they're turning into the most interesting 10 pages, which is a very frustrating thing when you put so much time doing everything else. I'm like, I love these 10 pages. But they're basically where I reflect on what is a crawling body? What does it feel for me to be crawling? Even though I am not William, I cannot pretend to be William. I crawl after William. But there is a reality to a crawling body that only a crawling body knows. And so I can speak to that in that dissertation. So I use it as an entry point in that. Yeah, it is. It's terrifying. It really is. The reason I power pose is because I'm like, wow, you gonna do this again? There's always a moment before where I'm like, this is so silly. Like, what are you doing? You're gonna go roll on the floor. Like when you break it down to just the physicality of it, if you decontextualize it, this is like, and I felt that a lot more performing in public space, like in a museum. It's like people will watch you, and then there's a whole other series of questions about the politics of that and whatever. But in public space, it was a lot of that. It's like you get those hard questions, like, what are you doing? Like, you must be a student, you must be an artist, like you're wasting your time or whatever, you know? But in terms of what it's brought me, I think, and like in relationship to that question of breaking out of the shell or whatever, I feel like I'm very comfortable as a performer because I've developed a vocabulary and I'm comfortable in that mode, and I've learned my body and I've learned the spaces that I interact in, and I know what that is, but that is not necessarily how I feel outside of that space. And I have a lot of friends who are performance artists who also feel that, who are not comfortable necessarily as themselves or taking up space unless they are in that moment where the space is warranted because they've been given that space to perform. And I feel that a lot. You know, I like move back and forth on this, and I think I have over the years as like I've grown and personality has changed and stuff, but I like don't like to take up space unless, I'm in that performance art mode, and then I think like, okay, this is space that's been given me to do that, and it's a very special moment. And I think one of the things about that is, and speaking about comfort and stuff, the thing that I haven't really discussed here, but maybe is like important to elaborate, and Linda can definitely speak to this, is that the performance art community globally, but also in Canada, is a very tightly knit, and tightly knit in a good and sometimes bad way, but in a way that when I said like 3 people showed up to watch me drag Robert Smithson, those people are like my close friends. And it's not because I see them all the time, but I see them at festivals, and when I perform at a festival, they show up, and they watch me do silly things, and they watch me fail, and they watch me make an idiot out of myself, and they watch me cry after because I feel terrible about it, and I watch them do the same thing, and we go through this cycle. And so a lot of it has to do with that care. I've performed in contexts that you look at and you're like, ugh, this must have been amazing, in the da-da-da-da, and it's like, no, it felt terrible. There were 60 people, 200 people, 300 people in the room, but the work felt terrible. Like, no one was there for me. No one was there. I felt totally exposed. I felt vulnerable. I felt like I gave myself out, and no one was paying attention. No one saw me. And I feel foolish, and I feel stupid. And I've made pieces with 2 people there, and it's like, that was the best piece I made. And I think it a lot has to do because I feel like I make work for my friends. I make work for my community. I make work for curators and for directors and for festival organizers who put the work in and who show up and who trust me. Because it's a big gamble inviting a performance artist, especially one like me, who never makes the same work, who's just like a series of unpredictable happenings, who will go into your archives and pull things out and get, you know, whatever will happen. And it's like a big leap of faith, and I recognize that as an artist. And so in that, I feel protected and I feel seen, and I like try to exchange that. So in that, I think the question of being exposed and being vulnerable is a lot easier because I feel like the people I have the chance of working with most of the time create a safe environment for me to make, and I'm super thankful for that. Yeah, that's been really important. Like the question of who my parents are and like what I belong to. There was a really long period of time, especially when I was outside of Quebec, and like figuring out what my practice was, and having both the privilege of having like someone who can give you a studio crit like at home, and who's done it for years, and having someone who can give you the like perspective of applications and like what people are looking for and what's interesting in terms of like hanging and conservation and so on. Like that was, it was such a gift, you know. It allowed me to excel and move forward, and not only that, but I've been super lucky because my parents, as anyone who knows them here, like have been my #1 fans from the beginning in this, and have endorsed and like pushed and advocated for me in that and been super supportive. But that also at the beginning came with like, as you kind of are alluding to, like an unease and an uncertainty about like what are those advantages and what they mean in the structure of like me growing as an artist and me making a name. Because from the very beginning, when I would meet people, I would be like the son of, right? Like, oh, you're the son of, or I know your parents, or I know your dad, I know your mom. And sometimes with like a certain intonation where I'd be like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I have to call them and be like, Mom, Dad, did you do anything wrong with this person? Because anyways. But over time, what started to happen is that people started to know me for me. And I started to forge relationships in places that my parents had not been, or had been and hadn't been in many years. And even with people who my parents the person in Kentucky who is one of my first dad's gallery dealers who showed me, for me, as my work when I broke my nose, and who had shown my dad for many years, but for this opportunity had decided to show me. And so there was definitely a feeling that, that there was a time where I felt this tension and this uncertainty and this need to like keep a distance. And then at some point it was just this realization that like, this is my family and I'm super lucky to have this. And as I was describing, like, this is literally my family. Like, my parents are literally in the space and they're watching me do this, and it's part of my practice and it's part of my vocabulary and it's part of my genealogy. And so in the ways that I think I've tried, it's naturally cycled into my practice. It's not felt artificial, it's not felt forced. And it's just kind of also like become material as well as a support network, as well as like a life story and a family trip and a series of family trips. And I think it's also maybe, I don't know, I think they would feel the same, but it's also like been mutual. I think I like to say that I gave my dad's performance career a second breath, but he's choking in the front row. But there were moments where we were allowed to perform together, and then where he's now met people and people have been like, oh, you're Didier Morelli's father. Like, I met your son, like, your son did this, it was great, like, and so that's kind of flipped, and so there's been a nice transition, and I think there's been a nice period where now I feel like an adult, even though I still really don't, where I can feel like we are peers as opposed to I'm the son of, and I feel like I can hold my own weight when it comes to this space, and not only hold my own weight, but share it with them, and it's a joy to share it with them, and it's a joy to bring them with me and have these conversations after about how I mumble at the end of my sentences and how I should, be clear with that, and how I should add a slide, because that slide didn't show it clear enough, and that's just become part of the family dynamic in the core of it. So, yeah. Excellent question. I could not, that project is ongoing, I should have said, still haven't done it. I cannot perform, and it's not perform, I cannot be in that project, I cannot pursue that project without the belief that ultimately I could be able to do it. It's just a question of the right circumstances. And data might be against it, but it's like there is still a 0.0000001 chance. And so it very much exists in that space of improbability but possibility. But speaking to the more like physical elements of it, yeah, like I was doing it obsessively every day, and there was the only way to do it obsessively every day for a large period of time, and was to believe it and to think about it. And then to talk to people about how it was already happening and how it was happening in other spaces and how it was happening in other ways and how the sound was moving through my body, or talking to dancers and talking to people who were into meditation and moving through space. And so, although I'm still firmly committed to the physicality of it, the growth of it and the community it's generated and all of it, and the conviction that it's created in other people, where like I get emails sometimes, at 2 a.m. and it's like, I thought of you and I haven't heard of this person in 6 years, and like just like, oh, I just thought about you, I saw this video or whatever, has kind of like allowed it to keep generating itself. But it is totally sincere, and I believe in it, and I continue to do it. And it's like in vogue, because Marina Abramovich's biography was called Walking Through Walls 2 years ago. I'm going to sue her for copyright. That's the next thing I'm working on. And in Berlin, I forget which one, but there's a show that just opened in Berlin explicitly on performance called Walking Through Walls, in which I wasn't included. So we're also going to be suing them. So anyways, yes, so it does remain a central part. And clearly it's got capital in the art world, so I got to keep working on it. Oh, that's tough. What happens if I've been lost? Dad, do you have a... You're nodding. You're nodding in like a... What's been lost? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true. In this lineage, my grandfathers, yes, that's true. And grandmothers, yeah. I mean, so my dad, in this lineage of performance artists, there's also not... My dad and I are convinced that my grandfather and both grandfathers were performance artists also, just part of a generation where that wasn't a thing, and so it wasn't cataloged. But there is a photo of my grandfather when he decided to come in, my dad's dad, when he decided to come into the dining room. He was sort of he worked as working, store clerk, but so no connection to performance art, but he came into the kitchen wearing a large leaf blowing, sort of a leaf bag all the way up down to his waist, and just stood there in the middle of the space. And my grandmother was like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And he just stood there, and he thought it was the funniest thing. My dad has this fantastic photo that we use in a performance, and that we sort of cite back now as the first performance. So it's not entirely been lost, but it is sort of in the genealogy that I enforce here and that I look through. It's not necessarily one that's cataloged. But yeah, no, that gives me some things to think about. I'll get back to you.
I'll tag in because I've been quiet for a bit.
Oh, no. We're wrapping up. Thanks, everyone.
So that generation and their opportunities and privilege that I have and that you now have to be able to access a life in art making, which was not accessible for first generation immigrants from Europe, and other individuals who was left with the ambition of losing a father and working through depression. So for that generation, the idea of making art was so far away from anything they could even have dreamt about. And it took their work and sacrifices to allow both of them, all four of them, to allow us to be able to do that. And to tag on to that, those idea of privilege is how you carry on then through teaching, your articles you write in S Magazine, the 40 years of teaching that I've put in, and the generosity that's involved with engaging with younger artists and older artists of that community you described. So what was lost was the ideas of how culture has shifted and changed, and that Canada as a young culture of immigrants did not have those opportunities. And they are now more available and more than ever threatened by the realities that we have to do through the politics